You can reread and reread and maybe work through, okay, maybe I didn't understand that moment or that line or that word. Okay, I'm going to go back through and see whether I can work it out for myself, with a sense that maybe I never will fully know what it means.
Hello, Joanna.
Hello, Santhia.
Nice to see you today, and thanks for joining me for this podcast and our conversations on Rilke.
Thank you very much for having me.
But before we dive into Rilke as a poet and his works, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. Who are you and what do you do?
So my name's Joanna Raisbeck. I'm currently the Montgomery Fellow in German Literature at Lincoln College here at Oxford. And I teach German literature and translation here. And I also work in research the 18th and 19th centuries.
What does that mean in terms of texts that you read? Why that period?
Why that period? So I came into it through the philosophy of the period and how it interacts with literature. Mm-hmm. And there's a really interesting confluence going on around 1800. Then both, if we think about names that we might have heard of, like Goethe, but also Romanticism is shot through with a lot of philosophy. So that became very interesting for me. But I've predominantly worked actually on poetry, really. So I've worked on Caroline von Günnerode, who's one of the outstanding female poets of the period, who also wrote dramas and prose texts as well, but is most well known for her poetry. So that's really where I was coming into it.
That's a very particular way of reading, and obviously you're a specialist on that. Do you remember the first moment before you became a professional reader, where you connected with literature personally?
So before I became a professional reader, I do distinctly remember the first time before I started my graduate studies, having never really read some of Friedrich Hölderlin's longer poems before. And there's a very long and amazing elegy called Brot und Wein, bread and wine. And I distinctly remember reading it, not understanding any of it, but having more a feeling by the end that something had happened and it doesn't have to be profound, but the poem had moved me in a particular way that I couldn't explain to myself. And that was the feeling that made me think, okay, I want to know more about this, about how this is working. Maybe I can't even write about it as an academic, but this has some meaning for me through that really quite fantastic experience.
Oh wow, I really like that. And I think it leads us directly to Rilke, who's someone I enjoy to read, but sometimes I have the feeling I don't get it. What do we do with that feeling in reading when we have the feeling, I don't understand it, I am not sure what it means?
It can mean a whole variety of different things, I would say. So it can be on the level of not really knowing what to do with the words, the way the words are combined in different ways in poetry. I think there's also a distinction between how we read critically and how we're sort of taught to read as interpretation, and how we read sort of normally if we're reading novels or even if we're watching TV or watching films. So we have to separate out those feelings and also accept the fact that we won't ever come to a final or correct interpretation of a poem, because every time you read something, you will get something different out of it. And that's actually what makes poetry really good, is because often it's relatively compact and you can reread and reread and maybe work through, okay, maybe I didn't understand that moment or that line or that word. Okay, I'm going to go back through and see whether I can work it out for myself, with a sense that maybe I never will fully know what it means.
So we have to live with that uncertainty as people who study literature.
Yes, absolutely, but not in the sense of thinking that literature in general is so profound or so mysterious that is beyond our grasp or beyond our reach, but rather that we understand that the act of reading and also the act of interpretation is something that is simply an ongoing and never-ending process.
Mm-hmm. Would you encourage a playful approach when you start reading a new text, for example? Do you know that feeling when you read a poem and you have the sad uncertainty that we just discussed and the feeling on top of that, and those two sort of wrestle with each other, or like both present within you, and then you move back and forth and you have certain ideas that might not be part of the text, but they're sort of part of the echo of how the text resonates with you. Would you allow that to be part of the process of reading, or
Yes,
Shall we put that aside?
Yes, absolutely, because I think in order to sort of confront the ways in which you're reading things, then you can slowly refine your responses. And if we're talking about the active interpretation as a particular way of reading, then you can determine, okay, you're having that sensation from the text. And often when we first start reading poetry, it's a lot of, I feel that this is the case, or this is the sense that I have. And then you can start to think critically in terms of, okay, where does that come from? How can we locate that in the text? And then that would be the loop that we can do and try to get something more out of it.
You know what? I would like to test it with the text that you brought today with you, which is one of Rilke's poems.
It is indeed one of Rilke's poems, so from the second part of the Neue Gedichte. So shall I go forth and read it out? Okay, so it's called Kritischer Artemis. Wind der Vorgebirge, war nicht ihre Stirne wie ein lichter Gegenstand. Glatter Gegenwind der leichten Tiere, formest du sie. Ihr Gewand bildend an die unbewussten Brüste wie ein wechselvolles Vorgefühl. Während sie, als ob sie alles wüsste, auf das Fernste zu geschürzt und kühl, stürmte mit den Nymphen und den Hunden, ihren Bogen probend, eingebunden in den harten, hohen Gurt. Manchmal nur als fremden Siedelungen, angerufen und erzürnt bezwungen von dem Schreien um Geburt.
Wow. What is it about?
What is it about?
Well, how do we do it?
How do we do this? Well, the title, one question we always have to ask when we're looking at poetry is, does the title help us at all? And immediately here we're given a hint by Rilke with Kritischer Artemis, so the Cretan Artemis. Artemis then as the goddess of the hunt in classical antiquity, particularly this is the Greek name, the Roman name would be Diana, a goddess of the hunt, of chastity, I think also of childbirth, protecting childbirth as well. So that gives us a sense that this is the topic of the poem. The Cretan Artemis is a bit of a puzzle. It's not really clear what quite this is referring to. It could be a Cretan goddess who then got identified with Artemis in antiquity. But if we know Rilke more broadly and specifically the Neue Gedichte, we can think about this as following on his classical interests. And there is a very famous other poem in the collection called The Archaic Torso of Apollo. So I would read this very much. I mean, it's the next poem after that one in the collection. So if we were to follow the line through from that, then we're thinking, okay, is this about a statue of Artemis or not? But I'm not sure it necessarily is in quite the same way as that previous Apollo poem works. So we're about Artemis, we're about the ideas of Artemis as well. What would you say about the poem, Santhia?
I have all the confusion that I always fear when reading poetry is I feel like I remember Artemis from reading art history in the past. So with that in particular, I was reminded of all the pictures that I have in my visual memory, you know,
Yes.
So I can see her. I get a feeling for her, although I have no idea who she is exactly. I cannot identify her, but I get an impression of who she might be through that. And I can't even tell you why exactly, and I'd like to try to find out how that sort of happens, that I have the feeling of having an impression for me.
Yes, because there's a sort of layering of certain associations that are being sort of presented to us. So if we look at, this is a sonnet, which means we have a 14-line poem. We have an 8-line section, then followed by a 6-line section.
So very strict form.
Traditionally an extremely strict form, and one that is also usually a sign of ambition on the part of the poet. If you write a sonnet, you're really trying to prove how good a poet you are. And it has to be said that Rilke is fantastic at manipulating the form and doing things with it that are very interesting.
So to break this down, if I may, he has chosen the form probably. Let's make this assumption. He has chosen the form.
Yes.
He had a theme, whatever that theme was, and then he kind of put the theme into the form.
Exactly.
Crafting it really well as he did.
Yeah. Yes, and to give an example of that, so in that sort of 8-6 division, you have 2 blocks of 4 and then 2 blocks of 3. And one of the things that Rilke is very good at is breaking this or fusing the distinction between then the stanzas, so the different blocks that we have of the poem. So we have in the first instance, to come back to the ideas of Artemis, these the glatte Gegenwind der leichten Tiere, which you might think of, she's the goddess of the hunt. So
yes.
there are animals.
And she has usually deer around her.
There are deer around her, exactly. But der leichten Tiere, which also recalls the ein lichter Gegenstand in the preceding line. There are all interesting resonances and sound between those two lines.
So leicht and licht, even if you don't understand it, it just sounds beautiful.
It sounds beautiful, and there's just a it's not a strict rhyme at all, but there's just a repetition there that's interesting.
Which role does the sound play when thinking about poetry?
It's very important, and it's very important for Rilke in particular. I think here we have particular patterns. Ihre Stirne wie ein lichter Gegenstand, so the I sounds that are picking up there. Glatter Gegenwind der leichten Tiere, also important, because Gegenwind then matches onto Gegenstand. And then there's a tension there between an object, Gegenstand, something very solid. Ein lichter Gegenstand, though, that's an interesting idea in itself. And then you have glatter Gegenwind. So we immediately have something solid versus something there's movement and solidity going on.
And sometimes Rilke even invites the invisible, doesn't he? In connection with things that are very familiar, that we can touch and see, and then there's something else beyond that. And he kind of moves back and forth between those.
Yes, I would say so, absolutely. There can be a sense of something beyond the material world that we inhabit that Rilke is picking up, and could probably put him in a line of poetry coming from Romanticism as well. That's not sort of, I suppose, religious in a conventional sense that we might have associated a few centuries prior, but certainly there are intimations of something else out there. You could see it in other poets at the time as well. I mean, Hugo von Hofmannsthal is also someone who's got a slight metaphysical edge to his poetry, as in reaching for something that is beyond our humdrum everyday reality. So that's interesting here. I'm not sure we have it so much a sort of sense of transcendence or a sense of something other in here, apart from the series of associations with the goddess.
I wanted to ask about that. What about the goddess herself? I mean,
the goddess herself, there seems to be a two-part thing that's going on here. Because what's fascinating is, and we see this in other poems in the collection, is the use of address. So we are told that, okay, we have war nicht ihre Stirne wie ein lichter Gegenstand. Okay. Again, it's interesting, we're describing a goddess, but we're describing her in the past tense. That's intriguing in itself. And then we have the last line of the first four-line block, four-line stanza here, formtest du sie. Formtest du sie. So there's an idea that the du, the addressee here, is actually the person who's responsible for making the goddess manifest in some way.
Almost sculpting her. And we mentioned earlier in a different episode that Rilke was really working with Rodin and interested in sculptures and art and all of that. So we get the notion of that here.
We get the notion of that, but I think in a slightly different sense. Ihr Gewand bildend an die unbewussten Brüste wie ein wechselvolles Vorgefühl. Now I have to say, ein wechselvolles Vorgefühl is so suggestive. This is one of those moments, I think, where we sit and think, we're not really sure what this means.
We don't have the answer.
We don't have the direct answer. But there's, this idea of the formation of this statue in some way. Is it through the act of seeing itself? But we have this idea of sort of text and texture and textile, ihr Gewand bildend an die unbewussten Brüste, that seems important here. And then the unbewussten Brüste as well is the sense then of the statue being this inanimate object that's being formed and sort of enlivened by the addressee. We don't have sight as I think explicitly as being brought in here as we have it in other
between the lines.
It's in between the lines.
It teaches us about how we see things and what happens when we see things.
Because that is so important for other poems in the very, very famous other poems in the collection. Not only the Apollo poem, and I think there's one of the Apollo poems, but also for Der Panther as well. So that idea of seeing and being seen seems to be important. But this first block of the poem doesn't seem to be about the goddess per se. It seems to be about the formation of an idea that is then there's a reciprocity between the du, the addressee, and the formation of the goddess. And then we have this really interesting turn with the während sie, als ob sie alles wüsste, that the goddess has this independent existence too. And then we have a series of associations to do with the hunt. Nymphen und den Hunden, ihren Bogen probend, again a really nice internal rhyme, eingebunden in den harten hohen Gurt. And then at the very end we have the associations then with protecting childbirth in some way. But then von dem Schreiben Geburt and the poem stops there, there has to be some significance to that. I mean, how would you read that final line?
In the second part, I recognized the goddess
Okay, interesting.
as someone I can recognize. Whereas the first part, as you mentioned, is just something coming into being, something being formed. We don't know who it is, you know. And then in the second half, we realize who she is.
Yes.
And I recognized her through the attributes, the animals, she's a hunted goddess, you know, and all of that. But the last line, von dem Schreien Geburt, who cries here? Whose cry is it? And this is intriguing.
Was that completely ambiguous whether it's...
And then it just ends. And it leaves us, like I think the last line is the one that sticks with us after reading. At least that was my experience.
Yes, because we have sort of intimations of emotion. Erzürnt bezwungen von dem Schreien Geburt is the most sort of intense moment that we have there. So erzürnt is interesting in itself, and then von dem Schreien Geburt, and it becomes then this sort of generalized sense of, are we back then to this idea of formation, of bringing something into being, which causes pain in some way.
It does, and erzürnt is a really old-fashioned word. I think many of our audience members might not even be sure what it means, you know? No. So we have words like that, and then we get the dictionary and look them up and then return to the text. So it's back and forth, and you sort of have to carry the text with you for a while and then read it again to make sense.
And that's precisely correct, because I think erzürnt, yes, it's old-fashioned, but then you can match it up to slightly more common, but still high register or sort of sophisticated words that we have today. So you think Zorn, zornig, to do with anger, rage, but erzürnt then is extremely literary too. So.
We can create a mind map around the words that Rilke uses.
And that's
wonderful.
Actually where poetry is extremely helpful, because it exposes us to the creative possibilities of the language.
Which sort of Rilke poem, to move on from that one, stayed with you personally? Did you have a moment in your life as a reader and then scholar of texts where you thought like, okay, I resonate with this one in a different way? Talking about Rilke in particular.
So looking at Rilke in particular, I would say probably the one poem that I remember very much from studying poetry as an undergraduate was O Brunnenmund, which is a later poem from the Sonetta and Orpheus, and which is about the flow of a fountain, the spout of a fountain. But it's not actually really about that. It's about speaking. It's about poetry as well, and the act of communication. And it's it's extremely fine in terms of, again, the use of sound and that's what makes Rilke, I think, it really does stand out as a poet. I also have had to teach some of the other poems from this collection for many years, and the Archaischer Torso Apollos. I'm always confounded by the very famous bit of the final line, Du musst dein Leben ändern, and that makes me, I always wonder what is going on here. How the poem opens up suddenly at the end, and you're wondering, is this meant seriously? Is this a sort of profound experience we're supposed to be thinking about? And I never know what the answer is, and I think that's what brings me back to Rilke, is that he's suggestive without providing you, as maybe the sonnet form can do in other senses, a clear answer or a clear sort of statement of intent, which certainly can be the case if you go back into maybe even into the English tradition with Shakespeare. There's a very clear sense of where it's going.
That's very interesting, actually, that you, as someone who teaches it, return to the same line, like the same poem, but especially that same line, Du musst dein Leben ändern, every year in a way, and you come back to it as a different reader every year, I assume, and it still is open and you still have questions about it. And I think that sort of sums it up why poetry matters to me, doesn't it?
Yeah, you always, I mean, it's a truism that you always find new things in a text every time you return to it. But I think there's a certain sensitivity that you can develop through just reading lots of poetry. But then every time you come back and you think, no, there are things I've missed. There are things, there are some elements. We could stay and talk about this poem for 14, 15 minutes, 2 hours, and we wouldn't have exhausted it. It is simply not possible to do so.
Yeah, could return tomorrow and rethink it again,
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Which is wonderful. If there is one thing that you would give young readers onto their ways of reading poetry, what would it be? Spontaneous thought on that, perhaps?
Well, one remedy to being scared of poetry is reading a lot of it. Yeah. But I think also it doesn't have to be mysterious. It doesn't have to be profound. I mean, there are poems that are there that are just jokes as well. And I think because of the way in which poetry is positioned in our culture too, it can come across as something that's a bit scary and a bit elite. But actually it's not. Poetry is about a creative play with language, and it is extremely good if you're learning a language to be exposed to the poetry. Because as we've spoken about, Rilke is a fantastic example because he's so attentive to sound, to rhyme as well. We haven't spoken about the rhyme, but rhyme is, he's one of the great craftsmen of rhyme in the German tradition. So if you want to get into the language and its rhythms and its patterns and how the language works, it's all there in poetry. And when I've been teaching this, then one of the ways in which you can get students interested in poetry is just thinking about the language very, very closely. If they're interested in the language, they'll get interested in poetry.
Thank you so much.
Thank
This
you
was a
very
wonderful
much.
conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.